Close your eyes for a second and picture ancient Greece. Marble statues, philosophers in flowing robes, olive trees swaying under the sun. It looks peaceful, right? Beautiful, maybe even relaxing, no snap out of it, because the truth is, ancient Greece was nothing like the serene postcard in your head. It was dirty, it was dangerous, it smelled like sweat, sewage, and fish that had been out in the sun for way too long. And trust me, Yahweh's you, with your air conditioning and iced coffee, wouldn't last a single day there. Welcome to boring history for sleep. Why you wouldn't last a day in ancient Greece and more. The bedtime history you never knew you needed. We're about to peel back the marble facade and show you just how uncomfortable, unhygienic, and downright brutal life really was in the so-called cradle of Western civilization. So get cozy, because after hearing what daily life was like back then, you're either going to fall asleep or be very, very grateful for your modern bed. Imagine waking up in a cramped, smoky room, no windows, just a small clay lamp burning olive oil and an overwhelming smell of sweat, dust, and old goatskins. Welcome to ancient Greece, a land often glorified for its philosophy and architectura, but rarely praised for its hygiene, comfort, or survival odds. Before you get any ideas, let's be clear, you wouldn't last a day. You, with your heated blanket, oat milk latte, and a vague idea of what democracy is. Let's start with the basics. Plumbing, it doesn't exist. You're thinking aqueducts and Roman bath-strong civilization. In most Greek cities, waste disposal meant tossing things into the street. Toilets were pits. Public latrines were communal experiences. You wiped with stones or bits of broken pottery. Soft tissue. Dream on. Now, let's discuss meals. Forget about avocado toast. Breakfast, if you were lucky, was barley bread dipped in wine. Not wine and cheese, just wine. Water wasn't safe to drink, so everything, including breakfast, was infused with alcohol. Lunchtime, more bread, maybe some olives. Meat was a luxury, usually reserved for religious festivals. And if you were a slave, you got the leftovers, if there were any. Ah yes, slavery, you could very well be one. Ancient Greece wasn't all Socratic dialogues and gymnasium games. 1/3 of the population in Athens were slaves. Captured in war, born into it, or just unlucky. Your job, everything from mining silver to tutoring a spoiled Athenian brat. Even if you were a free male citizen, say, in Athens life wasn't much better. You'd spend your day debating politics and laws with other men, while women were largely confined to the house. And democracy, only adult male citizens could vote. That excluded women, slaves, foreigners, and even poor people. What about education? Sure, if you were rich, you'd learn rhetoric, music, and maybe how to wrestle in the nude with other boys. But if you were poor, forget it, no school for you, your curriculum was labor, obedience, and survival. Let's take a short walk wearing your leather sandals down a typical Greek street. The stones are jagged. The animals are everywhere. There's no sanitation, and you're constantly dodging donkey droppings. People are shouting in the marketplace, selling fish that's been sitting in the sun for hours. Everything smells of sweat, sea salt, and fermented fish sauce. Your medical care, bloodletting, leeches, and prayers to Apollo. Hippocrates was a bright light, but even he had more in common with a medieval barber than your local clinic. Get a fever, could be humors, could be divine punishment. Either way, you're not getting antibiotics. And don't even try to shower. Baths weren't daily. Soap didn't exist in the modern sense, and deodorant. A sprig of thyme stuffed under your armpits. Sleepy yet? Let's move to warfare. If you were a Spartan, you started training at age 7. Not just push-ups and sit-ups, but beatings, starvation, and learning to kill without mercy. If you were Athenian, you served in the army or navy. Wars were constant. Persians, Spartans, other Greek cities, dates. If you weren't fighting, you were rebuilding. Even peace wasn't peaceful. Politics were cutthroat. Public shaming was a sport. If someone didn't like you, they could ostracize you, literally vote you out of the city for 10 years. Cancel culture. Ancient Greece invented it. So, why wouldn't you last a day in ancient Greece? You like comfort. Ancient Greece is uncomfortable. You enjoy food variety. Ancient Greece is bread and wine. You expect health care. Ancient Greece offers leeches. You value equality. Ancient Greece favors elite males. You want privacy. Ancient Greece has public toilets and shared lives, and that's just day one. Let's say you're a woman in ancient Greece. Congratulations, your life is now defined by 3 core tenets: silence, obedience, and childbirth. If that doesn't sound thrilling, you're starting to understand why history can be boring enough to put you to sleep, if not horrifying enough to keep you awake. Contrary to what modern interpretations may suggest, being a woman in Athens wasn't about lounging in white linen or debating Plato. It was about staying indoors, spinning wool, and producing male heirs. Let's unpack this a little. In ancient Athens, the idea of freedom was reserved almost entirely for adult male citizens. These men could vote, own property, initiate lawsuits, and speak in the assembly. Women, not so much. Women were under the guardianship of a male relative for their entire lives, first their father, then their husband, and eventually their son if they outlived both. They couldn't vote, own land, or even appear in public alone without risking their reputation. Their value was directly tied to their womb, how many sons they could produce, and how pure their lineage was. Marriage wasn't about love, it was a transaction. Girls were married off between ages 12 and 15 to much older men. Often, they met their husbands on the wedding day. Dowries sealed the deal, and the woman's job was now clear: run the household, make clothes, and birth as many children as the gods allowed. Infant mortality rates were high, and maternal death was common. Giving birth was like rolling the dice, except the dice were rigged against you. Most Athenian women were expected to stay out of the public eye. They lived in the gyneceum, the women's quarters, and handled all domestic duties. Their social life, non-existent. Reading and writing were not usually taught unless they were from an extremely wealthy family, and even then, only enough to manage household records. Contrast that with men who spent time at the agora marketplace, engaged in politics, debated philosophy, and trained in the gymnasium. Women weren't even allowed to attend the theater, let alone act. Ironically, religion was one of the few areas where women had visibility. Priestesses played important roles in major cults, like that of Athena or Demeter. The Oracle of Delphi, I was a woman after all. But this visibility was rare and symbolic. It didn't translate into political power or autonomy. Now, if you were born in Sparta, your experience would be different. Spartan women were educated, physically trained, and allowed to own property. They spoke freely and were known to taunt their husbands. Sounds progressive, right? Not quite. Spartan society was obsessed with warfare and eugenics. Women were trained to produce strong sons for the state. Marriage rituals included abduction and ritual head shaving. Spartan women may have had more freedom, but it came with the expectation of manufacturing soldiers. One often misunderstood aspect of ancient Greek society is the role of the heterolite courtesans who were educated, cultured, and often the only women allowed to attend symposia, drinking parties. With intellectual discussion, they could wield influence through charm and intelligence, but they were also outsiders. Don't confuse them with common prostitutes who worked in state-sanctioned brothels, often under brutal conditions. Sex work was legal, taxed, and widespread, but it was not glamorous. It was survival. Men could have affairs, keep mistresses, and spend time with hetero or male lovers with little social consequence. Women caught in adultery could be divorced, disowned, or even executed, and homosexuality. For men, especially in Athens, relationships with younger boys were not only tolerated, but structured as educational and even spiritual mentorships. Women had no such sanctioned outlets. If you were a woman and someone wronged you, stole from you, abused you couldn't represent yourself in court. A male guardian had to sue on your behalf. In many cases, a woman's testimony wasn't even admissible. In ancient Greece, beauty standards were suffocating. Pale skin was the ideal, symbolizing wealth and the privilege of staying indoors. Women went to absurd lengths to lighten their complexion with lead-based powders. The irony, that makeup was toxic. Body image, thin and modest, clothing was restrictive, and fashion never changed. If you liked variety in your wardrobe, tough luck. You wore a peplos or chiton, basically a fancy potato sack, every day. The truth is, the Enlightenment of Athens was a spotlight that shone on a select few, wealthy male citizens. Everyone else, women, slaves, foreigners, lived in the shadows of this so-called golden age. So if you're picturing yourself as a radiant Greek goddess lounging in a sun-dappled marble courtyard, think again. You'd more likely be indoors, in the dark, spinning wool and hoping your husband remembered your name. If you thought surviving a day in ancient Greece was all about dodging donkey droppings and political backstabbing, welcome to the nightmare that was ancient Greek medicine. Spoiler, it wasn't much better. Let's start with the basics. Disease was everywhere. The concept of germs. Nope, didn't exist. Medicine was a wild mix of superstition, luck, and sometimes a little practical knowledge, but mostly luck. The Greeks believed in something called the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to this ancient medical system, good health was a balance of these fluids, and illness was caused by an imbalance. So if you had a fever, it might be because you had too much blood, or if you were lethargic, maybe too much phlegm. How did they try to fix this? By balancing these humors, mostly through bloodletting, purging, vomiting, and other unpleasant treatments. Sounds like a spa day from hell. Hippocrates, born around 460 BC, is often hailed as the father of modern medicine. He tried to separate medicine from magic and superstition, insisting that illness had natural causes, and that doctors should observe and record symptoms carefully. Sounds promising, right, but even Hippocrates worked within the framework of the four humors. His treatments were still mostly about balancing humors with diet changes, rest, and sometimes drastic procedures like bloodletting. He also recommended things like diet, exercise, and baths, which sound familiar, but often the baths were dirty, and the diet was limited to what you could afford or scavenge. If you needed surgery, congratulations, you were brave or desperate. Ancient Greek surgery was basic and brutal. They had scalpels, knives, and cauterizing irons, but no anesthesia as we know it today. If you broke a bone, they might reset it and bind it. But infections were common and often deadly. The concept of sterilizing instruments, non-existent. You might walk into the surgeon's hut and see tools lying in the dirt. Sanitation in Greek cities was abysmal. Garbage was thrown in the streets, waste dumped in the open, and water sources were often contaminated. Epidemics were frequent and terrifying. The plague that struck Athens during the Peloponnesian War wiped out a huge percentage of the population. Despite Hippocrates' efforts to rationalize medicine, many Greeks still turned to religion for cures. Temples to Asclepius, the god of healing, dotted the landscape. People would visit these temples seeking miracles, offering sacrifices, and sleeping in special dormitories called a baton to receive divine visions that might cure them. Healing rituals involved snakes, which were sacred to Asclepius, chants, and sometimes bizarre procedures. Magic spells and charms were common for all sorts of ailments. Malaria was endemic in some parts of Greece, spread by mosquitoes from marshy areas. Parasites, tuberculosis, typhoid, and a host of skin diseases were rampant. Without antibiotics, a simple cut could turn deadly. Childbirth was a major risk for both mother and infant. Midwives were often women who had survived childbirth themselves, passing down knowledge orally. There were herbal remedies, but many were toxic or ineffective. Infant mortality rates were high. Many children didn't survive past their 5th birthday, which shaped family dynamics and social structures. If you were a mother, you were constantly worried about losing your children to disease or malnutrition. The Greeks didn't understand mental illness as we do today. Conditions like depression, anxiety, or psychosis were often attributed to divine punishment or possession by evil spirits. Treatment involved rituals, exorcisms, or sometimes just confinement. The idea of therapy or medication didn't exist. Bathing was done occasionally, not daily. Soap, as we know it, didn't exist. People rubbed olive oil on their skin and scraped it off with a tool called a strigil to remove dirt and sweat, but not everyone had access to this. Hair and teeth care were rudimentary. Some used abrasive powders or vinegar rinses, which often did more harm than good. Imagine getting a scrape while walking down a street covered in animal waste. That scrape gets infected. You have no antibiotics, no antiseptics, and no real way to fight the infection. You might get a fever, swell up, and die. If you were enslaved, your medical care was even worse. You might be treated as property rather than a patient. Slaves working in mines or fields suffered injuries, respiratory diseases, and exhaustion, often untreated. So, would you survive a day in ancient Greece? Maybe. Would you survive a week, a month? Probably not, unless you were incredibly lucky or very wealthy with access to the best care, which still wasn't great. Ancient Greek medicine laid some groundwork for modern science, but its practitioners were working in the dark, guided by superstition and limited knowledge. The reality of disease, injury, and death was brutal, constant, and terrifying. If you think ancient Greece was all about peaceful philosophical debates and olive branches, think again. War was the blood-soaked heartbeat of this civilization. Whether you were Spartan, Athenian, or from some obscure polis, chances are you'd spend much of your life training for, fighting in, or recovering from war. And if you're not ready for a dose of gritty, uncomfortable reality, you probably wouldn't last long on the battlefield or even in the shadow of it. War wasn't just an occasional event, it was a constant state. The Greek cities, states were fiercely independent, often at odds with one another. Alliances formed and shattered, rivalries turned bloody, and the fight for resources, land, and honor was relentless. From childhood, boys were drilled in the art of war. This was especially true in Sparta, where from age 7, boys were taken from their families and thrust into the agoge, a brutal military training system designed to turn them into nearly emotionless killing machines. Forget modern boot camps. The agoge was a survival of the fittest regime. Boys were starved, beaten, and taught to steal without getting caught, because getting caught meant punishment. They learned to fight naked literally, endure pain without complaint, and suppress emotion. Weakness was punished harshly. The goal: create soldiers so tough, so disciplined, they could face death without fear. Family bonds were severed, loyalty was to Sparta alone. Most Greek soldiers were hoplites, heavily armed infantrymen. Their weapons and armor included spear dory, around 7-9 feet long. The spear was the primary weapon used for thrusting. Shield aspes or hoplon, a massive round shield, often made of wood and bronze, used both defensively and offensively. Helmet bronze, often with a crest, covering the head and face. Breastplate and greaves, bronze armor protecting the torso and lower legs. Short sword xiphos, for close combat if the spear was lost. The hoplite's shield was so large it covered the soldier's body and part of his neighbor's. This design allowed for the famous phalanx formation. The phalanx was a dense, rectangular formation of hoplites, standing shoulder to shoulder. The front ranks held spears forward, shields locked, creating a nearly impenetrable wall of bronze and wood. Movement was slow and deliberate. The phalanx relied on discipline and unity. If one soldier faltered, the whole line could collapse. Fighting was brutal and close. There was no room for individual heroics. Athens, with its powerful navy, specialized in sea battles. Their main ship, the trireme, was a fast, agile warship with 3 rows of oars on each side. The primary tactic was the deeplas breaking the enemy line and ramming their ship with a bronze ram on the prow, hoping to sink or disable them. Naval battles were deadly and chaotic. Rowers were often slaves or lower-class citizens, risking their lives for the glory of Athens. Despite all the romanticism around hoplite warfare, the reality was gruesome. Battles were loud, muddy, and chaotic. Screams and clashing metal filled the air. Injuries were common. Swords and spears didn't just wound, they tore through flesh and bone. The hoplites' armor offered protection, but gaps existed, and spears could pierce shields. If you were wounded, chances were slim that you'd get proper medical care. Often, comrades carried the injured off the field, but infections and untreated wounds led to death. War wasn't just physical. Psychological tactics were vital. Soldiers shouted, banged shields, and used war cries to intimidate opponents. Spartans were known for their fearsome reputation. They believed in inspiring terror to win battles before swords even crossed. War drained the city-states economically and socially. Farmers and artisans were conscripted, leaving fields untended and workshops silent. Families mourned lost sons, brothers, and fathers. War widows faced uncertain futures. Wars also shaped politics. Victories led to increased prestige and power, while defeats could lead to exile or loss of citizenship. Between Athens and Sparta, the Peloponnesian War 431–404 BC epitomized the destructive nature of Greek warfare. It lasted almost 30 years, featuring sieges, naval battles, and brutal massacres. The war devastated Athens with a deadly plague, political instability, and eventual defeat. Not all warriors were citizens. Mercenaries hired from foreign lands fought for pay. These soldiers were often treated with suspicion, but were essential for prolonged campaigns. While women didn't fight, they suffered the consequences. They managed households alone, dealt with food shortages, and grieved lost relatives. Spartan women, due to their unique social role, were expected to encourage their sons to be brave warriors, and were known to be unusually outspoken for their time. War was intertwined with religion. Before battle, soldiers sought the favor of gods through sacrifices and prayers. Victories were attributed to divine approval, defeats to divine wrath. Ancient Greek warfare was brutal, exhausting, and ever present. The ideal of the heroic warrior battling for honor was real, but so were the screams, the blood, and the countless dead left in the dust. If you thought you could pick up a spear and survive, think again. So, would you last a day on the battlefield? Probably not without dying of wounds, exhaustion, or fear. If you think ancient Greek religion was just a bunch of polite rituals and happy gods lounging on Mount Olympus, buckle up. Ancient Greek religion was a wild, chaotic, and often terrifying affair, that influenced every aspect of daily life from politics and war to farming and family. And if you weren't careful, you might just find yourself cursed, haunted, or driven mad. This chapter will show you why, without a solid understanding of their gods and monsters, you absolutely wouldn't last a day in ancient Greece. The Greek gods weren't distant, perfect beings. They were deeply flawed, petty, violent, and often downright dangerous. Zeus, the king of gods, was known for his thunderbolt and temper, but also for his endless string of affairs, often with mortal women, which sparked countless tragic myths. Hera, Zeus' wife, was jealous and vengeful, frequently punishing Zeus' lovers and their children. Poseidon, god of the sea, could cause storms and earthquakes if angered. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, was fierce but also cunning. Each god had their own personality, agenda, and grudges. The gods didn't just watch from afar, they meddled in human affairs constantly. They rewarded loyalty and piety, but also cursed, punished, or even destroyed those who disrespected them. Imagine waking up knowing that the gods are watching you 24/7, ready to punish a careless word or disrespectful action. That was ancient Greek religion in a nutshell. People made offerings every day. Small sacrifice is of food, wine, or animals to keep the gods happy. Festivals were frequent and extravagant, featuring feasts, processions, athletic contests, and plays. Failing to honor the gods properly could bring disaster. Crop failures, diseases, or military defeats were often interpreted as signs of divine displeasure. If you wanted to know your future or the future of your city-state, you went to an oracle. The most famous was the Oracle of Delphi, where the priestess Pythia, in a trance induced by mysterious vapors, would deliver cryptic prophecies supposedly from Apollo. These predictions shaped political decisions, wars, and personal lives, but the ambiguous nature of the oracles often led to tragic misunderstandings and unintended consequences. Greek mythology was full of terrifying creatures: the multi-headed Hydra, the deadly Medusa, the half-man, half-bull Minotaur, and the vengeful Furies, to name just a few. Heroes like Heracles, Perseus, and Theseus battled these monsters, but their victories came at great personal cost. Madness, exile, or tragic deaths were common. Myths often explored human weakness. Is jealousy, pride, wrath, showing that no one, mortal or divine, was safe from suffering or destruction. The Greeks believed that mental illness was often caused by the gods as punishment for hubris, excessive pride, or other offenses. Madness wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a warning to society about the dangers of angering the divine. Beyond the public rituals, secretive mystery cults offered personal salvation and a chance at immortality. The Eleusinian mysteries, dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, promised initiates a better afterlife, but details were closely guarded. Participation was exclusive and required oaths of secrecy. For many Greeks, these mysteries were a source of hope in an uncertain, often brutal world. Unlike modern concepts of heaven, the Greek afterlife was a gloomy underworld ruled by Hades. Most souls drifted aimlessly in shadowy existence with few rewards. Proper burial rituals were essential to ensure the dead's peace. Failure to perform them risked restless spirits returning to haunt the living. Countless stories tell of entire cities destroyed for offending the gods. Troy, Thebes, and even Athens faced divine retribution for hubris or impiety. For individuals, this could mean curses, sudden illnesses, or worse. Religious law was strict, and blasphemy or sacrilege was punished severely. In ancient Greece, the gods were everywhere watching, judging, punishing, and sometimes helping. Religion wasn't just a part of life, it was life. And without respect for the gods and their terrifying powers, your chances of survival were slim. So, Would you last a day in ancient Greece without offending a god or falling victim to a monster? Probably not. If you think ancient Greek food was just olives, grapes, and fancy banquets, think again. For most people, especially the poor or slaves, daily meals were basic, repetitive, and sometimes downright unpleasant. The food culture was deeply tied to religion and social class, and festivals were as much about feasting and drunkenness as they were about honoring the gods. Let's explore why, without serious adaptation, you wouldn't last a day or a meal in ancient Greece. The ancient Greek diet was heavily based on what we might call the Mediterranean triad: grains, olives, and grapes. Bread made from barley or wheat was a staple, often hard and coarse compared to modern loaves. Olive oil wasn't just a condiment, it was a fundamental cooking fat and flavoring. Grapes were eaten fresh or turned into wine, which was usually diluted with water. Drinking pure wine was considered barbaric. Vegetables like onions, garlic, lentils, and beans were common, while meat was a luxury mostly reserved for festivals or the wealthy. Breakfast was typically a light meal, bread dipped in wine or olive oil, sometimes with figs or olives. No bacon and eggs here. For many, it was just enough to get through the morning. Lunch was usually small leftovers, fruit, or more bread. Dinner, deipnon, was the main meal, often eaten late in the day. In wealthier homes, dinner could be a lavish affair with multiple courses, including fish, meat, vegetables, and desserts like honeyed fruit or nuts. For the majority of farmers, laborers, and slaves, meals were much simpler. Porridge made from barley or wheat, maza, vegetables, and occasional cheese or fish. Meat was rare. When available, it was usually salted or dried, as fresh meat was expensive and perishable. Religious festivals were the highlight of the social calendar, with massive communal feasts and drinking competitions. Sacrificed animals were roasted, and meat was shared among participants. Wine flowed freely, often mixed with herbs or spices. These events could last days and featured singing, dancing, and performances. Some ancient Greek delicacies might gross you out: garum, a fermented fish sauce used as a condiment; dormice, eaten stuffed with nuts and honey; seafood, sometimes eaten raw or pickled; offal and blood, common in some dishes, which might shock modern sensibilities. Food preservation was limited. Salting, drying, and fermenting were common. Without refrigeration, spoilage was frequent. Cooking methods varied, but open fires and clay ovens were standard. Foodborne illness was common, and there was no understanding of germs. Drinking, wine, water, and potions wine was a daily staple, but always diluted with water. Drinking undiluted wine was seen as uncivilized. Water quality varied. Sometimes people drank from wells or springs, but contamination was a risk. Alcohol was often used medicinally or in rituals. Meals were social occasions, especially for men. Symposiums, drinking parties, were exclusive male gatherings featuring drinking games, philosophical debates, and entertainment. Women rarely attended symposiums, and lower classes ate separately. Offerings of food and drink to gods were central to Greek religious practice. Sacrifice involved rituals and communal feasting, reinforcing social bonds and divine favor. For many Greeks, food scarcity was a reality, especially during sieges or poor harvests. Famine led to social unrest, increased crime, and weakened armies. Ancient Greek food culture was complex, tied deeply to social status, religion, and survival. For outsiders, the diet could be bland, strange, or downright gross. Would you last a day eating like an average ancient Greek? Maybe, but you'd probably be hungry, confused, and occasionally sick. If you think ancient Greece was a land of democracy, philosophy, and freedom, think again. For a huge portion of the population, Life was a brutal struggle under the yoke of slavery and servitude. Slaves were everywhere in homes, workshops, farms, and even on the battlefield. They built cities, toiled in fields, and lived at the mercy of their owners. Without understanding this dark undercurrent, you wouldn't last a day in ancient Greece. Slavery in ancient Greece was widespread and varied. People became slaves through war captivity, piracy, debt, or birth into slavery. Some were prisoners of war, stripped of their rights and sold in slave markets. Others fell into slavery due to economic hardship. Slaves came from all over the Mediterranean and beyond Thracians, Scythians, Phoenicians, and many others. Life was harsh and monotonous. Slaves performed the most grueling tasks: farming, mining, crafting, cooking, cleaning, and even tutoring children in wealthy households. They had no legal rights, were considered property, and could be bought, sold, punished, or killed at their owner's whim. Slave owners could be cruel. Whippings, beatings, and psychological abuse were common. Some slaves ran away or rebelled, but such actions were risky and often punished severely. Domestic slaves worked as cooks, cleaners, nurses, and personal attendants. Their proximity to their owners sometimes allowed for better treatment, but they were still vulnerable. In rural areas, slaves worked the fields, harvesting crops under harsh conditions. In mines, especially silver mines like Laurium near Athens, conditions were deadly. Many slaves died young from exhaustion and disease. Some slaves served as rowers in naval fleets, such as Athens' powerful navy. Life on a trireme was brutal, and slave rowers faced long ayurs, poor rations, and brutal discipline. Slaves had no political or legal rights, but could sometimes earn or be granted freedom manumission. Freed slaves, known as freedmen, still faced social stigma and often limited opportunities. Slavery was integral to the Greek economy and society, enabling wealthy citizens to pursue politics, philosophy, and art. However, reliance on slaves also created social tensions and ethical debates. Not all servants were slaves. Some were free laborers or hired workers, but the lines could blur. Though rare and usually unsuccessful, slave revolts did occur. The fear of rebellion influenced how slaves were controlled and treated. Female slaves had additional vulnerabilities, including sexual exploitation. Some became concubines or were forced into prostitution. Slaves often formed communities, practiced religion, and maintained cultural identities to survive mentally and emotionally. Slavery was a grim reality of ancient Greece. Without being born free or wealthy, survival was a constant struggle against oppression, exploitation, and danger. Would you last a day as a slave in ancient Greece? Almost certainly not without suffering. When you hear ancient Greece, you might imagine the birthplace of democracy, a grand idea where citizens gathered to debate and decide their city's future. But the reality, ancient Greek democracy was messy, dangerous, and far from the peaceful political system we idealize today. For most people, especially outsiders or the politically inexperienced, the world of Greek politics was a perilous game where a single wrong move could cost you everything, including your life. If you weren't careful, you wouldn't last a day. Ancient Greek democracy, especially the one in Athens, was revolutionary for its time. Citizens could vote, speak, and participate directly in government. But citizen was a very exclusive term. Women, slaves, metics, foreign residents, and children were excluded. Only free adult males born to Athenian parents had political rights, a minority of the population. So, for many, democracy was more of a distant ideal than a lived reality. The ecclesia, or assembly, was where citizens gathered to vote on laws, war, and public policy. Meetings were held on the Phoenix Hill in Athens, often with thousands attending. Debate was fierce and sometimes brutal. Orators used powerful rhetoric to sway the crowd. But this was not a polite discussion group. Personal insults, intimidation, and manipulation were common. One of the most famous but terrifying political tools was ostracism. Citizens could vote to exile a person for 10 years, often without any formal charges or trial. Ostracism was supposed to protect the city from potential tyrants or dangerous politicians, but was often used as a weapon in political rivalries. Politics was a high-stakes game. Powerful figures could rise rapidly but also fall hard. Accusations of corruption, impiety, or treason could lead to trials, imprisonment, or death. Famous examples include Socrates, who was sentenced to death for corrupting the youth, and Alcibiades, a controversial general and politician who faced exile multiple times. Skilled speakers called demagogues could stir public opinion, often manipulating the assembly for their gain. These figures sometimes promoted dangerous policies, leading Athens into disastrous wars or internal chaos. Athenian courts were another venue for political power struggles. Large juries of citizens judged cases that often had political undertones. Public speeches decided guilt or innocence. Rhetoric was key, and trials could be spectacles of persuasion. The Boule, or Council of 500, prepared legislation and oversaw daily government operations. Members were chosen by lot, not election, supposedly to reduce corruption and ensure fairness, but political factions still influenced decisions. Despite ideals of fairness, Athens was rife with factionalism, conspiracies, and street violence. Political enemies sometimes resorted to assassination or forced exile. Other cities-states had different systems: Sparta's rigid oligarchy, Corinth's tyranny, and Thebes' mixed government. Power dynamics varied, but all Greek politics could be ruthless and unstable. Wealthy citizens had more political influence. Campaigning, hosting events, and bribery were common tactics. Poor citizens often had limited access, despite formal equality. The Athenian democracy was fragile and ultimately short-lived. After decades of wars, internal strife, and external pressure, it collapsed under Macedonian conquest. Greek democracy's brilliance lies in its innovation, but also serves as a warning about populism, factionalism, and political instability. Ancient Greek politics were a dangerous arena where power was contested fiercely and often fatally. The ideals of democracy existed alongside violence, manipulation, and fear. If you thought you could walk into the assembly, speak your mind, and survive unscathed, think again. Would you last a day in ancient Greek politics? Without allies, rhetorical skill, and nerves of steel? Probably not. The image of the ancient Greek warrior, a heavily armored hoplite standing firm in the phalanx, is iconic. But the reality of warfare was far more brutal, exhausting, and terrifying than any statue or painting suggests. Ancient Greek warfare was a constant part of life for many cities-states. If you were unlucky enough to be a soldier or a civilian caught in the crossfire, surviving a single day on the battlefield or in a siege was a brutal challenge. This chapter will explain why war was a grim and unforgiving fact of life, why the methods and weapons used made it deadly, and why you absolutely wouldn't last a day in ancient Greek warfare. Greek cities-states were rarely at peace. Rivalries over land, trade routes, honor, and political dominance meant frequent skirmishes, raids, and full-scale wars. The Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, the Persian invasions, and countless smaller conflicts defined the era. War wasn't a rare event, it was an ever-present threat. Most Greek soldiers were hoplites, citizen soldiers equipped with heavy bronze armor, a large round shield, aspes, spear, and sword. The hoplite fought in a tightly packed formation called the phalanx. Success depended on discipline and cohesion. One break in the line could mean disaster. Battles were brutal but short, often lasting only a few hours. Hoplites clashed in waves of spears and shields, stabbing, pushing, and trampling. The noise, chaos, and bloodshed were overwhelming. Casualties were high, and death was common. Sieges were even worse. Cities could be surrounded for months or years, cutting off food and water supplies. Siege engines like catapults hurled stones or flaming projectiles. Defenders faced disease, hunger, and constant fear. Survivors often faced slaughter or enslavement if their city fell. Greek navies used triremes fast warships rowed by hundreds of men, including slaves and the poorest citizens. Rowing was grueling labor, with exhaustion and exposure as constant threats. Naval battles were chaotic, with ramming maneuvers and boarding actions leading to close combat. Greek bronze armor was heavy, hot, and cumbersome, but essential for survival. Spears, swords, and arrows caused devastating wounds. Medical knowledge was primitive. Many wounds became infected. Hoplites trained rigorously. Physical fitness and teamwork were critical. Poorly trained soldiers were liabilities, often killed quickly or causing the line to collapse. Witnessing death, killing, and suffering led to mental trauma, though the Greeks lacked concepts like PTSD. Heroic death was glorified, but many soldiers lived in constant fear. War affected civilians, 2 villages burned, crops destroyed, and people enslaved. Fleeing was risky, and refugees faced poverty and disease. Before battle, rituals and sacrifices were made to appease gods and seek favor. Superstition and omens influenced decisions, but didn't protect from death. Dead soldiers were honored with funerals and monuments. Families mourned but also used heroic myths to cope with loss. Without armor, training, or support, surviving a day in Greek warfare was nearly impossible. Fear, exhaustion, wounds, and sheer violence were overwhelming. Ancient Greek warfare was a brutal and constant reality, shaping lives and history. The idealized image of hoplites masks the harshness of blood, death, and fear that dominated. You wouldn't last a day on the battlefield or under siege without strength, skill, and a bit of luck. When you think of ancient Greece, you probably imagine wise philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle sitting calmly under olive trees, discussing truth, justice, and the nature of existence. But the reality was often much more dangerous. The pursuit of knowledge and the questioning of established beliefs came with a heavy price. For many philosophers, their ideas challenged not only tradition, but also the political and religious status quo, and that made them targets. If you thought you could safely question the gods, the government, or social norms without consequence, think again. You wouldn't last a day. Philosophy in ancient Greece began as an attempt to understand the world through reason rather than myth. Pre-Socratic thinkers like Thales, Anaximander, and Heraclitus sought natural explanations for phenomena, challenging traditional religious stories. Socrates is the most famous example of a philosopher who paid a high price for his questioning. He wandered Athens, asking uncomfortable questions, exposing ignorance, and encouraging critical thinking. Socrates' approach involved asking probing questions to expose contradictions in people's beliefs. While effective, it often embarrassed and angered powerful Athenians. In 399 BC, Socrates was charged with corrupting the youth and impiety. Despite opportunities to escape, he accepted his sentence and drank poison hemlock. His death highlighted the dangers of challenging established norms. Plato, Socrates' student, wrote dialogues exploring justice, politics, and knowledge. He distrusted democracy, fearing mob rule. Aristotle, Plato's student, emphasized empirical observation and wrote extensively on ethics, politics, and science. Philosophy often questioned traditional religious beliefs, leading to accusations of impiety. Many philosophers walked a fine line to avoid offending religious authorities. Besides official gods, mystery religions offered secret teachings and rituals. Philosophers sometimes critiqued these cults, risking backlash. Philosophers gathered in schools like Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum. Symposiums, drinking parties were venues for philosophical debate, but could also lead to intense social pressure. Philosophical questioning was sometimes seen as madness or dangerous eccentricity. Some philosophers lived reclusive lives or faced social isolation. Women were largely excluded from formal philosophical schools, but contributed in some circles. Figures like Hypatia, later in history, showed women's potential roles. Despite dangers, Greek philosophy laid the groundwork for Western thought. The questioning spirit endures, but was risky in its birthplace. If you openly challenged powerful beliefs or leaders, you risked imprisonment, exile, or death. Survival required tact, alliances, or a willingness to die for ideas. Ancient Greek philosophy was brilliant but perilous. Questioning everything was revolutionary and dangerous. Would you last a day challenging the gods and rulers? Probably not without risking everything. When you think of ancient Greece, it's easy to picture powerful philosophers, heroic warriors, and democratic citizens. But what about women? The truth is harsh. Women in ancient Greece were largely confined to the domestic sphere, denied political rights, legal independence, and often even basic freedoms. Life for a woman was a constant struggle against social restrictions, limited education, and dependence on men. If you were born a woman in ancient Greece, surviving a day without oppression, control, or danger was almost impossible. Women were primarily responsible for managing the household and raising children. Their roles were centered on marriage, childbirth, and maintaining family honor. Women had no political rights and could not own property independently in most states. They were legally dependent on their father, husband, or male guardian. Marriage was often arranged for economic or political reasons. Women married young and were expected to bear children, especially sons. Most women were denied formal education. Some elite women received private tutoring, but philosophy, politics, and arts were male domains. Sparta was unusual in granting women more freedoms, including property ownership and physical training. Even so, their primary role was to produce strong warriors and maintain the household. Women handled domestic chores, cooking, weaving, cleaning, and sometimes worked in markets or temples. Poor women might also labor in agriculture or craft production. Women participated in religious festivals and rituals, sometimes wielding significant influence as priestesses. Religious roles offered limited but important public presence. Women's sexuality and behavior were tightly controlled to protect family lineage. Adultery was harshly punished, primarily targeting women. Childbearing was both a source of power and vulnerability. Infant mortality was high, and women faced health risks in childbirth. Many women were slaves, facing even harsher conditions including sexual exploitation. Figures like Sappho, Aspasia, and Diotima defied norms but were exceptions. Their stories often survived because they intersected with male-dominated history. Without rights, autonomy, or protection, women lived under constant surveillance and control. Freedom was limited, and danger, physical, social, or legal, was always near. Women in ancient Greece lived in the shadows of freedom, trapped by social, legal, and cultural chains. Surviving a day meant navigating a world designed to limit and control. Would you last a day as a woman in ancient Greece? Only with immense resilience seemed even then, life was harsh. In ancient Greece, religion wasn't just a private belief, it was the very fabric of daily life. The gods were everywhere, in the sky, on Mount Olympus, in temples, and even in your home. But religion was no gentle comfort. It was a complex system of rituals, sacrifices, and rules, with serious consequences for mistakes or disrespect. If you thought you could ignore the gods or play fast and loose with sacred customs, think again. You wouldn't last a day without the gods' favor, and even then, the stakes were terrifyingly high. The ancient Greeks worshipped a vast pantheon led by Zeus, the king of the gods. Others included Athena, wisdom and war, Apollo, music and prophecy, Artemis, hunt and wilderness, Hera, marriage, and many more. Each god had distinct personalities, domains, and temperaments often unpredictable and jealous. Religion varied by city-state. Athens revered Athena, Sparta honored Ares, Delphi. I was sacred to Apollo. Local cults and heroes added layers of complexity to worship. Temples were grand and majestic, but also intimidating places. They were centers of religious and political power, where priests performed rituals and offered sacrifices. Religious rituals were complex and precise. Sacrifice is usually animals were essential to appease the gods. Festivals like the Olympics, Dionysia, and Eleusinian mysteries mixed religion with social life. The Greeks believed the gods were deeply involved in human affairs, rewarding or punishing mortals. Disrespecting the gods could bring curses, plagues, or disaster. Oracles, like the famous Oracle of Delphi, were consulted for guidance. Interpreting signs, dreams, or animal entrails was serious business and often politically charged. The Greek afterlife was bleak, a shadowy existence in Hades. Religious focus was more on this life and securing favor than on a hopeful afterlife. Religion reinforced social order and political authority. Leaders used religious festivals and divine claims to legitimize power. Violations of religious law could lead to exile, execution, or social disgrace. Notable case includes Socrates' execution for impiety. Individual devotion coexisted with state-sponsored religion. Private rituals and household gods were vital for daily protection. Besides official religion, many Greeks practiced superstitions and magic, often frowned upon by authorities. Failing to observe rituals or offending a god could bring swift and terrible consequences. Ancient Greeks lived in constant awareness of divine presence and judgment. Religion in ancient Greece was a powerful, demanding force shaping every aspect of life. The gods were unpredictable rulers of fate, and surviving meant constant vigilance and respect. Would you last a day ignoring or disrespecting the gods? Absolutely not. When people think about ancient Greece, they often imagine grand temples, mighty armies, or brilliant philosophers. But beneath all that was a complex and demanding economic system, one that shaped daily life in every city-state and tested everyone's ability to survive and thrive. Unlike modern economies, ancient Greece's economy was built on agriculture, trade, slavery, and constant negotiation. You wouldn't last a day without knowing how to navigate this intricate web of markets, debts, and social expectations. This chapter will explore the gritty reality of the ancient Greek economy, from the harsh life of farmers and merchants to the invisible but critical roles played by slaves and women. It will also reveal how economic pressures shaped social dynamics and even sparked conflicts. Agriculture was the foundation of the Greek economy. Most people lived in rural areas and depended on farming for survival. However, Greek terrain was mountainous and rocky, making large-scale farming difficult. Farmers cultivated olives, grapes, barley, and wheat, often struggling against poor soil and limited water. Small farms, big challenge, is most farms were small plots worked by family members. Survival depended on the harvest, which could be ruined by drought, pests, or war. Debt was a constant threat. many farmers fell into poverty or sold their land. Land ownership and social status. Land was a major source of wealth and power. The wealthy elite owned large estates, sometimes worked by slaves or tenant farmers. Land disputes were common and could lead to social unrest. Because of limited agricultural resources, trade was essential. Greek cities-states exported olive oil, wine, pottery, and metalwork, and imported grain, timber, and luxury goods. Markets, agoras, were bustling centers of commerce and social life. Merchants navigated complex trade networks across the Mediterranean. Success required knowledge of routes, languages, and negotiation skills. Coinage was invented by the Greeks, revolutionizing trade. However, understanding the value of different coins and avoiding fraud was vital. Slavery was widespread and integral to the economy. Slaves worked in households, agriculture, mines, workshops, and as rowers on ships. Slaves had no rights and lived at the mercy of their owners. Conditions were brutal, especially in silver mines and quarries. Slavery allowed wealthy citizens to accumulate more wealth and leisure time. It also deepened social divides and fueled tensions. Though largely excluded from politics, women played vital economic roles. They managed household production, ran shops, and sometimes worked as artisans. Women's economic activities were often informal and undervalued. Yet some women, especially in poorer classes, earned a living through weaving, selling goods, or prostitution. Debt was a constant hazard for farmers, merchants, and even cities-states. Failure to repay debts could result in loss of land, freedom, or even enslavement. City-states levied taxes on trade, land, and wealth. Funds were used to finance wars, public festivals, and building projects. Economic pressures sometimes sparked social revolts and political changes. The debt crisis in Athens contributed to the rise of tyrants who promised relief. Success in the ancient Greek economy required shrewdness, negotiation skills, and adaptability. Without these, poverty and hardship were inevitable. The ancient Greek economy was a demanding and complex system rooted in agriculture, trade, and slavery. To survive and prosper, you had to master its challenges or face poverty, debt, or worse. Would you last a day without economic skill and savvy? Almost certainly not. Ancient Greece is often romanticized as a cradle of civilization full of art, philosophy, democracy, and heroic tales. But daily life for ordinary Greeks was often tough, unpredictable, and far from glamorous. Whether you were a farmer, craftsman, merchant, or even a citizen in a bustling city, life demanded constant effort, resilience, and adaptability. This chapter will pull back the curtain on the everyday realities of ancient Greeks, their homes, food, work, social structures, and the challenges that made survival a daily test of endurance. You wouldn't last a day here without grit, practical skills, and the ability to navigate complex social rules. The majority of Greeks lived in simple homes made of mud bricks or stone, often cramped and basic. Citted, dwellers lived in crowded neighborhoods where sanitation was poor and diseases spread easily. Architecture and household life homes centered around a courtyard, with rooms for cooking, sleeping, and storage. Running water was rare, so water had to be fetched daily. Sanitation and health risks no sewage systems meant waste disposal was primitive, leading to frequent illnesses. Plagues and infections were common and deadly. Ancient Greek diets were based on grains, vegetables, fruits, fish, and occasionally meat. Meals were simple, often porridge or bread with vegetables, olives, and cheese. Food preparation and preservation cooking was done over open fires or simple hearths. Preserving food was a challenge. Drying, salting, or pickling were common. Feasting and fasting. Public festivals included lavish feasts, but everyday eating was frugal. Fasting or skipping meals was not uncommon due to scarcity. Most people worked as farmers, artisans, fishermen, or traders. Work was physically demanding, with long hours and little rest. Farming was backbreaking labor, vulnerable to weather and pests. Potters, blacksmiths, and weavers created goods essential for daily life and trade. Slaves performed many of the hardest tasks, from mining to domestic chores. Clothing was simple: tunics, chittons, cloaks, himation, and sandals. Bathing was a social ritual, but less frequent than modern standards. Public spaces like the agora were centers for socializing, politics, and commerce. Community bonds were strong but exclusive. Outsiders often faced suspicion. Education was a privilege for boys, focused on literacy, music, and physical training. Girls were educated mainly in household skills. Greeks enjoyed theater, sports, music, and festivals. Leisure was often communal and tied to religious events. Harsh winters, droughts, and wars could devastate communities. Social expectations and honor codes imposed constant pressure. Without practical skills, endurance, and social savvy, survival was doubtful. The constant physical and social demands made ancient Greek daily life unforgiving. Daily life in ancient Greece was a demanding blend of hard work, community, and ritual. Romantic ideas aside, you needed grit and adaptability to survive even a single day. Would you last a day in this world? Probably not without resilience and skill. When you picture ancient Greece, visions of hoplites in bronze armor, phalanx is marching in unison, and epic battles like Marathon or Thermopylae likely come to mind. War was central to Greek life, shaping politics, culture, and personal identity. But war was brutal, relentless, and unforgiving. It demanded physical endurance, mental toughness, and absolute loyalty. Civilians and soldiers alike lived with constant fear, hardship, and uncertainty. You wouldn't last a day as a Greek soldier or even a non-combatant caught up in the chaos of war without toughness, skill, and a readiness to face death. Unlike professional armies, Greek armies were composed mainly of citizens, soldiers called hoplites. Every free male citizen was expected to serve, train, and fight when called. Training was rigorous but not standardized. It depended on city-state resources and individual wealth. Hoplites wore heavy bronze helmets, breastplates, greaves, and carried a large round shield, aspes, spear, and sword. The phalanx was a tight formation of heavily armed infantry. Success depended on discipline, and cohesion. Breaking formation meant death. Ancient Greek warfare was direct, personal, and deadly. No modern medicine, no retreat in many cases. His wounds often led to infections and death. Fear, adrenaline, and the chaos of battle tested soldiers' nerves. Retreat or cowardice was stigmatized and punished harshly. Naval battles were critical, especially for Athens. Triremes were fast, maneuverable warships powered by rowers, often slaves or the poorest citizens. Conditions were cramped, exhausting, and dangerous. Rowers faced starvation, disease, and brutal discipline. War rarely stayed on the battlefield. Civilians suffered from raids, sieges, famine, and displacement. Sieges could last months or years, cutting off supplies and hope. Starvation and disease ravaged populations trapped behind walls. Wars could topple governments, create tyrannies, or spark revolutions. The decades-long conflict between Athens and Sparta devastated Greece. Civilian suffering, economic ruin, and shifting alliances made daily life dangerous. Women often managed households alone or faced violence and enslavement during conflicts. Physical demands, mental stress, and social pressures made war an unforgiving test. Without strength, courage, and luck, death or captivity was almost certain. Ancient Greek war was relentless, brutal, and deeply embedded in society. Surviving a day in this world required more than skill. It demanded resilience and a willingness to face death. Would you last a day on the battlefield or in a war-torn city? Almost certainly not. Ancient Greece is famously the birthplace of Western philosophy. The names of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle evoke images of deep contemplation, reasoned argument, and groundbreaking ideas about ethics, politics, and the universe. But this intellectual world was demanding, competitive, and often dangerous. Philosophy in ancient Greece was just an academic pursuit. It was a way of life that challenged social norms, religious beliefs, and political authority. If you thought you could simply waltz into this world of ideas without consequence, think again. You wouldn't last a day without sharp wit, courage, and the ability to face hostility from powerful enemies. Philosophy began as a radical attempt to understand the world without relying solely on myth or religion. Thinkers called pre-Socratics explored nature, existence, and knowledge using observation and reason. Socrates pioneered the method of questioning everything elentious. He challenged assumptions and exposed ignorance but made many enemies. His relentless questioning aimed to uncover truth, but could embarrass or threaten listeners. Accused of corrupting youth and impiety, Socrates was sentenced to death. His fate shows how dangerous intellectual dissent could be. Plato, Socrates' student, founded the academy and developed theories on forms, justice, and the ideal state. His dialogues explore profound ethical and metaphysical questions. Plato argued rulers should be philosopher, kings, blending wisdom and power. This idea challenged existing political structures. Aristotle focused on observation, categorization, and logic. He tutored Alexander the Great, influencing politics and education. Rhetoric was a prized skill in public life. Mastery of persuasive speech could win votes, sway juries, or spark conflicts. Sophists taught rhetoric for pay, often criticized for relativism and deceit. Philosophers pursued truth, but sometimes saw sophists as rivals. Philosophy and politics were deeply intertwined. Public debate, assembly speeches, and court cases required intellectual agility. Philosophical challenges to traditional gods and myths risked accusations of impiety. Education was limited to wealthy males. Philosophical knowledge was often exclusive, reinforcing social hierarchies. Philosophers often lived modestly, but faced social isolation or hostility. Public lectures and discussions were common, but sometimes dangerous. The intellectual world was competitive, fraught with social risk, and required constant mental rigor. Without courage, critical thinking, and thick skin, you'd be crushed or silenced quickly. Philosophy was the heartbeat of ancient Greek culture, demanding, transformative, and risky. Surviving a day in this world meant engaging fearlessly with ideas and power. Would you last a day immersed in the fierce intellectual life of ancient Greece? Probably not. Ancient Greece is celebrated not only for its art and philosophy, but also for pioneering scientific thought and technology. From the geometry of Euclid to the mechanics of Archimedes, the Greeks made remarkable advances that laid the foundation for modern science. Yet, science was not a separate profession. It was entwined with philosophy, craftsmanship, and everyday problem-solving. Progress came through trial, error, and sometimes dangerous experimentation. You wouldn't last a day in this environment without an insatiable curiosity, sharp intellect, and a hands-on approach to challenges. Greek science began by seeking natural explanations for phenomena traditionally attributed to gods. Philosophers like Thales and Anaximander speculated about water, air, and earth as fundamental elements. Mathematicians such as Pythagoras, Euclid, and Archimedes formalized geometry and numerical theories. Euclid's work compiled centuries of geometric knowledge and became the foundation of math education for millennia. More than a formula, Pythagoras' work linked numbers to music, philosophy, and cosmology. Early Greek astronomers observed celestial movements, developing theories about the cosmos. Aristarchus proposed a heliocentric model centuries before Copernicus. Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine, advanced systematic observation and ethical practice. Galen built on earlier work to describe anatomy and physiology. Without modern tools, many explanations were incorrect or incomplete. Humoral theory dominated medical practice, often ineffectively. Greek engineers developed devices for construction, warfare, and daily life. Archimedes invented machines such as pulleys, levers, and war engines. His Eureka, a moment symbolized the blend of curiosity and practical problem solving. Greeks created early mechanical clocks and water, lifting devices essential for cities. Experimentation was risky. Errors could cause injury or death. Technological knowledge was often guarded or limited to certain groups. Science was closely linked to crafts such as metallurgy, pottery, and shipbuilding. Artisans combined theoretical knowledge with hands-on expertise. Without curiosity, practical skill, and resilience, you'd be overwhelmed. Failing to understand or respect the limits of knowledge could be dangerous. Ancient Greek science and technology were groundbreaking but demanding fields. To survive and contribute, you needed a sharp mind, practical skills, and the courage to challenge the unknown. Would you last a day in the inventive, risky world of ancient Greek science? Almost certainly not. Religion was woven into every aspect of ancient Greek life. The gods were everywhere, in the sky, the seas, the earth, and within every human action. Unlike modern secular societies, the Greeks believed the gods had direct influence over their fortunes and misfortunes, and ignoring or disrespecting them could lead to disaster. You wouldn't last a day in ancient Greece without understanding the religious customs, participating in rituals, and navigating the sometimes terrifying world of omens, sacrifices, and festivals. The Greeks worshipped a vast pantheon of gods, each with distinct personalities, domains, and demands. Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Demeter, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Ares, Aphrodite, Hephaestus, Hermes, and Hestia made up the core gods worshipped across city-states. Each god had their own cults, temples, and festivals. In addition to Olympians, many cities-states had local gods, heroes, and spirits linked to nature, the underworld, and ancestors. Myths explained natural phenomena, human behavior, and the origins of the world. Mythic stories were deeply embedded in art, theater, and daily conversation. Religious rituals were essential for maintaining favor with the gods. Sacrifice, ranging from small offerings to large animal or even human sacrifice, were central. Rituals took place in temples, altars, homes, and sacred sites. Public festivals brought entire communities together in elaborate ceremonies. Failing to perform rituals correctly could anger the gods. Priests and ritual specialists were responsible for ensuring proper rites. Oracles, such as the famous Oracle of Delphi, were consulted for guidance. Divination included interpreting bird flights, reading entrails, and interpreting dreams. Oracles were revered but often gave cryptic answers, leaving interpretation open. Festivals combined religious devotion with athletic contests, music, and drama. The Olympic Games originated as religious festivals honoring Zeus. Tragedies and comedies performed at festivals explored religious and moral themes. Beliefs about the afterlife were vague and often gloomy, focused on a shadowy existence in Hades. Hero cults offered hope for special honors after death. Religious practices could cause social tension, especially between traditional beliefs and new ideas. Women often played key roles in religious life as priestesses and participants in fema, lonely rites. Without respect for the gods and mastery of religious customs, you risked social ostracism, divine wrath, or worse. Religious knowledge was not optional, it was survival. Religion was a demanding, omnipresent force in ancient Greece, shaping every action and event. To survive a day, you had to honor the gods with correct rituals, respect sacred customs, and heed omens. Would you last a day in this spiritually charged world? Almost certainly not without deep understanding and respect. Ancient Greece is often hailed as the birthplace of democracy, but the political landscape was anything but simple or safe. City-states polis like Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and Thebes each had their own systems of governance, power struggles, and social dynamics. Politics wasn't just about voting or speeches. It was a high-stakes game of alliances, betrayals, and sometimes deadly violence. If you thought navigating modern politics was tough, surviving a day in ancient Greece's political arena would be an entirely different challenge. The polis was more than a city. It was a community with shared laws, customs, and a collective identity. Political participation was a privilege reserved for free male citizens, often excluding women, slaves, and foreigners. Each polis had its own constitution and political structure. Athens is famous for its early democracy, but other city-states had oligarchies, monarchies, or mixed systems. Athens introduced a radical political experiment where citizens could vote, debate, and hold office through institutions like the Assembly Ecclesia and the Council of 500 Bull. But participating in democracy demanded knowledge, time, and political savvy. You needed to be persuasive, informed, and cautious. Political enemies could destroy reputations or worse. Public scrutiny. Citizens faced constant debate and criticism in open forums. Litigation. Politics often led to lawsuits, sometimes weaponized for revenge. Exile and ostracism. Citizens could be ostracized, exiled for 10 years by popular vote, a political death sentence. Violence and coup. Assassinations and coups were not uncommon in turbulent times. In contrast, Sparta's political system was oligarchic and militarized. Power was concentrated in 2 kings and a council of elders, with a strict social hierarchy centered on warrior values. Political dissent was suppressed, and citizens were trained from youth to obey and fight. If you lacked discipline or loyalty, you would be marginalized or worse. The assembly, open debate but often dominated by powerful orators. The courts, legal battles were political tools. Corruption was common. The council managed daily governance but susceptible to intrigue. Greek politics extended beyond the polis. Alliances, leagues, and conflicts shaped the balance of power. The Delian League, led by Athens, and the Peloponnesian League, led by Sparta, exemplified this shifting, dangerous landscape. Philosophers like Plato and Aristotle wrote extensively about governance, justice, and the ideal state. Yet, practical politics was often messy, opportunistic, and brutal. Without sharp intellect, rhetorical skill, and ruthless pragmatism, political survival was unlikely. Naive idealism or weakness invited manipulation, exile, or death. Politics in ancient Greece was a high-risk, high-reward arena where power was contested daily. Surviving a day required keen understanding, boldness, and a readiness to fight not always with weapons, but often with words and alliances. Would you last a day in this fierce political world? Most likely not. Ancient Greece wasn't just about heroic battles, brilliant philosophy, and majestic temples. For the vast majority of people, farmers, artisans, laborers, and slaves' daily life was a constant struggle for survival. If you think modern hardships are tough, Imagine facing the brutal realities of ancient rural and urban living without modern comforts, social safety nets, or medical care. You wouldn't last a day as a commoner in ancient Greece without grit, resilience, and a bit of luck. Most Greeks were farmers who worked small plots of land growing grains, olives, and grapes. Others were craftsmen, potters, blacksmiths, or fishermen. They formed the economic foundation, but lived with insecurity, hardship, and little political power. Farming demanded back, breaking labor plowing fields with wooden tools, sowing seeds by hand, harvesting crops under the scorching sun. Seasonal pressures, planting and harvesting had to be perfectly timed. Weather disasters meant famine. Simple tools, no tractors or modern irrigation, everything was manual. Dependence on nature. Crop failure could spell disaster for entire families. The Greek diet was basic: bread, olives, cheese, and occasional fish or meat. Limited variety, fresh vegetables were seasonal, meat was a luxury. Preservation challenges: without refrigeration, food spoiled quickly. Famine and hunger, poor harvests caused widespread starvation. Most commoners lived in small, simple homes made of mud brick, crowded and dark. Houses had few rooms, little ventilation. No plumbing, water had to be fetched from wells or fountains. Sanitation was rudimentary. Fire hazards, open hearths were common and dangerous. In cities like Athens, artisans crafted pottery, metal goods, textiles, and tools. Small workshops, often family-run, cramped spaces. Competition and economic uncertainty. Markets were volatile, long hours. Craftsmen worked from sunrise to sunset. Slaves formed a significant part of the workforce, doing hard labor in homes, farms, mines, and ships. No rights, slaves were property, subject to harsh punishment, grueling conditions, especially in mines and on triremes. Fear and brutality, life expectancy was often low. Commoners had limited political rights, often excluded from decision-making. Women had even fewer rights, confined mostly to household roles. Illnesses, injuries, and infections were common and often fatal. No antibiotics or anesthesia. Minor wounds could become deadly. Child mortality, high infant and child death rates. Superstitions and remedies. Medicine mixed observation with magical thinking. Community support, families and neighbors helped each other. Religious rituals, many sought divine protection against misfortune. Adaptability, quick thinking was necessary to handle crises. Without physical strength, hard work ethic, and mental resilience, the demands of daily life would overwhelm you. Even minor injuries, illness, or bad luck could mean death. For common people in ancient Greece, survival was a daily battle against nature, poverty, and social constraints. You wouldn't last a day without toughness, resourcefulness, and a bit of fate on your side. Ancient Greece is cultural legacy. Art, theater, music, and literature shaped Western civilization profoundly. Yet beneath the beauty and creativity lay social pressures, intense competition, and cultural expectations that could overwhelm anyone unprepared. To thrive or even survive in this vibrant cultural milieu required more than passive appreciation. It demanded participation, understanding, and adaptability. Without these, you wouldn't last a day. Art wasn't merely decorative, it was a means of expressing religious devotion, political power, and social identity. Sculptures and pottery told stories of gods, heroes, and daily life, often reinforcing cultural values and ideals. Greek sculpture strove for idealized human forms, embodying harmony, balance, and proportion. Public statues honored gods and celebrated victories. Architectural marvels. Temples like the Parthenon symbolized civic pride and religious reverence. The expectations to produce or appreciate such perfection demanded education and aesthetic sensitivity. Greek theater combined religious ritual with drama, exploring complex human and divine themes. Tragedy and comedy, both were integral to festivals and social commentary. Audience engagement, attending performance, was a civic duty, and active participation through debate and critique was common. Failing to understand or respect theatrical conventions could mark you as uncultured or socially alienated. Poets like Homer and Hesiod, alongside playwrights and philosophers, shaped cultural identity. Epic poems, the Iliad and Odyssey, provided a shared narrative and moral framework. Philosophical works explored ethics, politics, and metaphysics, demanding intellectual engagement. Literacy was limited to elites. Without education, access to these cultural treasures was restricted. Music accompanied religious ceremonies, theater, and social events. Dance was often ritualistic, reinforcing group identity. Mastering or at least appreciating these arts required discipline and cultural immersion. Participation, cultural events were communal and expected. Conformity, artistic and literary themes reinforced social norms. Competition, artists and intellectuals faced constant rivalry. Social acceptance depended on cultural literacy and adherence to norms. The pressure to live up to cultural ideals could be stifling. Artists risked criticism, failure, or obscurity. Those outside elite circles struggled for recognition or inclusion. Without cultural literacy, social skills, and adaptability, you'd be isolated. You'd be lost in a society that prized knowledge, creativity, and participation. Ancient Greece's arts and culture were vibrant but demanding. To last a day, you needed more than passive interest. You had to engage, understand, and navigate complex social expectations. Would you last a day immersed in this cultural crucible? Probably not without preparation. Ancient Greece was a land of frequent warset. Estates often clashed over territory, honor, and power. War was central to Greek identity and politics, shaping societies and their destinies. Yet, behind the glory of epic battles and heroic tales lies a harsh reality. The life of a soldier was grueling, brutal, and unforgiving. If you thought modern military life was tough, imagine facing hoplite warfare, siege engines, and naval battles with minimal medical care and relentless physical demands. Without courage, discipline, and resilience, you wouldn't last a day on the ancient Greek battlefield. Most Greek soldiers were citizen, farmers called to fight as hoplite armed infantrymen. Equipment: a hoplite's panoply included a bronze helmet, breastplate, greaves, a large round shield aspes, spear, and sword. Cost: this armor was expensive and usually self-funded, so only men with some means served as hoplites. Training: hoplites trained to fight in a phalanx formation, tight, disciplined line of overlapping shields and spears. The phalanx was the dominant Greek battle formation, emphasizing collective action over individual heroics. Coordination: maintaining formation under pressure required intense discipline. Vulnerability: if the line broke, soldiers were exposed and vulnerable. Brutality: combat was close, quarters, and deadly. Greek naval power, especially Athens, relied on triremes fast, agile ships with 3 rows of oarsmen. Crew: triremes required skilled rowers, marines, and sailors. Tactics: battles involved ramming enemy ships, boarding actions, and coordinated maneuvers. Hazards: naval warfare exposed men to drowning, storms, and disease. City-states often fought over strategic locations, employing siege towers, battering rams, and tunnels. Siege life: harsh conditions, starvation, and disease were common. Engineering: Greeks developed sophisticated siege equipment despite technological limits. Fear and morale: soldiers faced fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty. Injuries, medical knowledge was rudimentary. Even minor wounds risked fatal infection. Death and heroism, dying gloriously in battle was idealized, but survival often meant trauma. By the classical period, mercenaries and professional soldiers supplemented citizen armies. Motivation, mercenaries fought for pay, sometimes loyalty was questionable. Discipline, professional soldiers trained year-round but faced dangers and harsh conditions. Physical fitness, soldiers trained rigorously to endure marches and combat. Weapon mastery, skill with spear, sword, and shield was essential. Tactical knowledge, understanding formations and commands could mean life or death. Without physical strength, courage, discipline, and mental toughness, you'd break under pressure. The relentless demands, brutal injuries, and psychological toll would overwhelm any unprepared individual. War shaped ancient Greece, its history and identity, but demanded extraordinary toughness. Surviving a day on the battlefield required more than courage, required rigorous training, solidarity, and sheer resilience. Would you last a day in the unforgiving world of Greek warfare? Almost certainly not. Education in ancient Greece was not merely about acquiring knowledge. It was a rigorous preparation for life, citizenship, and participation in society's cultural and political spheres. Yet this system was exclusive, demanding, and often harsh. Without discipline, curiosity, and social savvy, you wouldn't last a day navigating the educational and intellectual landscape of ancient Greece. In most Greek city-states, education began at home, primarily for boys of citizen families. From an early age, children were taught essential skills, morals, and physical training to prepare for adult responsibilities. Parents' role: mothers and tutors introduced children to basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. Moral lessons: respect for gods, elders, and societal norms was emphasized. Physical play: games helped develop agility and discipline. Around the age of 7, boys typically began formal schooling with a pedagogos tutor or pedagogue, often a trusted slave or freedman who supervised and disciplined. Subjects: reading, writing using wax tablets and styluses, poetry, music, and basic mathematics. Methods: memorization and recitation were central, rote learning dominated. Discipline: corporal punishment was common for mistakes or laziness. As boys grew older, education expanded to include music. Learning instruments and poetry was seen as essential for cultivating the soul and harmony. Gymnastics: physical training prepared boys for military service and civic duties. Rhetoric and philosophy: for those privileged, schools taught public speaking, logic, and ethical reasoning, critical for political life. By the classical period, sophists were professional teachers who offered advanced instruction in rhetoric and philosophy for a fee. Controversy: sophists were sometimes criticized for teaching relativism and persuasion over truth. Political relevance: their skills were vital for participation in democratic politics. Famous philosophers like Plato and Aristotle founded schools that became centers for debate, scientific inquiry, and ethical discussion. Curriculum covered metaphysics, biology, politics, ethics, and arts. Method emphasized questioning and dialogue. Accessibility: these schools were elite and often closed to the general populace. Education for girls was limited, usually confined to domestic skills and moral upbringing. Only in rare cases did women receive broader instruction, often through private tutors. Education reinforced social hierarchy. Only free male citizens had access to full schooling. Literacy rates were low. Oral tradition remained strong among the masses. Without discipline, mental endurance, and a hunger for knowledge, the educational system would crush you. The harsh punishments, relentless memorization, and social pressures were daunting. Education in ancient Greece was demanding, elite, and foundational for civic life. To last a day, you needed discipline, curiosity, and resilience. Would you survive the rigors of Greek education? Probably not without serious commitment. Religion was woven into every facet of ancient Greek life. It wasn't just a private affair. It was public, political, and deeply personal. Gods and goddesses were believed to influence everything from the success of a harvest to the outcome of battles. Without genuine faith, knowledge of complex rituals, and a healthy respect often, fear of the divine, you wouldn't last a day in ancient Greece. The gods didn't tolerate ignorance or disrespect lightly. Ancient Greeks worshipped a pantheon of gods, each with distinct personalities, domains, and demands. Zeus, Hera, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Poseidon, and many others formed an intricate divine family that shaped human fate. Polytheism, worship involved honoring multiple gods, each with specific festivals and rituals. Anthropomorphism, gods were human, like with virtues and flaws, making them relatable but unpredictable. Omnipresence, the gods' influence was believed to permeate the natural and social world. Religion was primarily expressed through ritual acts designed to please the gods and secure their favor. Sacrifices, animals, food, or libations were offered on altars, sometimes in elaborate ceremonies. Prayers and hymns, public and private prayers asked for protection, blessings, or forgiveness. Festivals, major events like the Olympic Games, Dionysia, and Eleusinian Mysteries combined sport, drama, and religious rites. Oracles and divination, consultation of oracles like Delphi was common to seek divine guidance. Correctly performing rituals required detailed knowledge of protocols. Purity, priests and worshippers had to maintain ritual purity, abstaining from certain foods or behaviors. Timing, festivals, and sacrifice had to occur at specific times aligned with lunar or solar calendars. Offerings, the type and quantity of offerings were crucial to avoid offending the gods. Mistakes could provoke divine wrath. While religion was public, individuals had personal beliefs and superstitions. Household worship, families kept household gods, lairs, and penates with small shrines. Omens and portents, signs from nature or dreams were interpreted as messages from the gods. Fear of the gods, many feared punishment, misfortune, or curses for disrespect. Temples employed priests and priestesses to conduct rituals and maintain sacred sites. Status, some roles were prestigious, others could be precarious or politically charged. Oracles, women like the Pythia at Delphi, served as divine intermediaries, delivering cryptic prophecies. Religion legitimized political power and social order. Rulers as divine agents, kings or generals claimed favor from gods to justify authority. Public festivals reinforced communal identity and civic pride. Temples served as centers of economic and social life. Disrespecting the gods or failing religious duties could lead to ostracism, fines, or worse. Sacrilege, desecrating sacred sites, was severely punished. Hubris, excessive pride or defiance of gods, was a common theme leading to downfall. Moral lessons, myths reinforced the dangers of offending the divine. Without genuine belief, knowledge of rituals, and fear of divine consequences, you'd alienate your community. You'd risk social exclusion, legal penalties, or personal misfortune. Religion permeated every aspect of ancient Greek life and was inseparable from identity and survival. To last a day, you needed faith, knowledge, and respect for the divine order. Would you survive a day indifferent to the God's will? Almost certainly not. Eating and drinking in ancient Greece was far more than a biological necessity. It was a deeply social, cultural, and sometimes religious act. The Greek diet reflected geography, class, and season, with distinctive customs that governed everything from meal preparation to dining etiquette. If you showed up with modern expectations about food safety, variety, or mealtime manners, you'd be shocked and probably wouldn't last a day without adapting quickly. The Greek diet was simple, mostly based on staples widely available in the Mediterranean climate. Grains, barley and wheat formed the cornerstone of most meals. Bread or porridge maza was common. Olives and olive oil, essential for cooking, seasoning, and even lighting lamps. Fruits and vegetables, figs, grapes, onions, garlic, lentils, and beans were common. Fish and seafood, in coastal regions, fish was a primary protein source. Meat, generally scarce and expensive, consumed mostly during festivals or special occasions. Dairy, cheese, especially from sheep and goats, was widely eaten. Wine, diluted with water, it was a daily staple, but also had ritual importance. Your social status dramatically affected the quality and quantity of food you ate. Elite citizens enjoyed richer diets with more meat, seafood, and imported delicacies. Common citizens mostly ate grains, legumes, vegetables, and occasionally fish or meat. Slaves and the poor had the most limited diet, often just bread, olives, and whatever scraps were available. Without wealth or connections, you would face real hunger and limited nutrition. The Greek day revolved around a few key meals: breakfast acrotisma, usually light, perhaps bread with olives or cheese and some fruit. Lunch, often a small, simple meal. Dinner deipnon, the main meal, often social and elaborate for those who could afford it. Meals were often communal, reinforcing social bonds and hierarchies. For Greek men, especially elites, the symposium was a key social institution. Setting: an evening drinking party with music, poetry, philosophical debate, and entertainment. Wine, always diluted with water to moderate intoxication. Etiquette: guests followed strict social rules, including the order of drinking and speech. Exclusion: women, except entertainers and slaves, were generally excluded. Failing to grasp the rules could cause offense or social exclusion. Ancient Greeks cooked using simple methods: grilling and roasting, common for meat and fish; boiling and stewing, used for legumes and vegetables. Baking: bread was baked in clay ovens or on hot stones. Preservation: drying, salting, and smoking were used for fish and meat. Limited refrigeration meant food spoilage was a constant concern. Food hygiene standards were minimal by modern norms. Water quality, often questionable. Wine was safer to drink. Storage: food was stored in clay jars but could attract pests. Cooking: leftovers could quickly spoil. Spoiled food sometimes caused illness. You'd need a strong stomach and quick adaptation to avoid sickness. Food was tightly linked to religion. Sacrifices: meat often came from sacrificial animals shared during festivals. Fasting: certain days or periods involved fasting or dietary restrictions. Offerings: food was offered to gods at temples or household shrines. Ignoring these customs could lead to social disapproval or accusations of impiety. If you expected modern meals with variety, refrigeration, and hygiene, the Greek diet could shock or sicken you. Monotonous staples might bore or frustrate. Limited protein could cause fatigue. Social eating rules could embarrass you. Poor sanitation risked illness. Adapting mentally and physically was essential. The ancient Greek diet and eating customs were a complex blend of necessity, culture, and social signaling. To last a day without getting sick, hungry, or socially alienated, you'd need to adapt quickly to the flavors, rituals, and realities of the time. Would you survive a day at the ancient Greek table without resilience and flexibility Probably not. Ancient Greece is famous for its warriors, battles, and military innovations. Yet warfare was brutal, exhausting, and far from the glorious ideal many imagine. Whether as a citizen, soldier, or a mercenary, surviving a single day in the chaos of an ancient battle or enduring the grueling life of a hoplite required exceptional physical fitness, mental toughness, discipline, and acceptance of harsh realities. In this chapter, we'll unpack the realities of Greek war, our training, equipment, tactics, social expectations, and why without preparation and grit, you simply wouldn't last a day. The backbone of Greek armies was the hoplite, a heavily armed infantryman drawn mostly from the middle and upper classes of the cities. State. Equipment. Hoplites wore bronze helmets, breastplates, greaves, and carried a large round shield aspes, spear doru, and short sword xiphos. Training. From youth, male citizens underwent rigorous physical training, particularly in Sparta, but also in Athens. Phalanx formation. Hoplites fought shoulder to shoulder in a tightly packed, rectangular formation that relied on unity and discipline. To survive, you needed strength, endurance, and unwavering discipline. Military readiness was a civic duty and deeply embedded in education and culture. Spartan agoge, the most famous training system, it was a harsh, state-run program emphasizing endurance, stealth, and combat skills from childhood. Athens, citizens trained during peacetime, often organized into militias or formal military units. Discipline, drilling in formations, and obedience to orders were vital. Breaking ranks was punishable by death. Without mental toughness and physical conditioning, the battlefield was a death trap. Ancient Greek battles were short, intense, and bloody affairs. Close combat, fighting was hand to hand with spears and swords. There was little room for retreat. Casualties, even victorious armies suffered heavy losses. Chaos, smoke, dust, shouting, and blood made the experience terrifying. No mercy. Captured enemies could be enslaved or executed. Panic or hesitation meant instant death. Many Greek cities-states, especially Athens, relied heavily on naval power. Triremes, fast, agile warships with 3 rows of oarsmen. Crew included rowers, often lower class citizens or medics, marines, and commanders. Tactics, ramming enemy ships and boarding actions were common. Harsh conditions, rowers endured exhausting physical labor, cramped quarters, and exposure. Survival at sea demanded stamina, coordination, and nerves of steel. Not all soldiers were citizen hoplites. Many cities-states hired mercenaries. Motivation, mercenaries fought for pay, often without loyalty beyond the contract. Diversity included Greeks, foreigners, and even slaves in some cases. Reputation, mercenaries were sometimes viewed with suspicion or disdain. Risk, without the communal ties of citizen soldiers, mercenaries often faced harsher fates. Lacking social support, mercenaries had to rely solely on skill and luck. Beyond physical demands, warfare exacted a heavy mental price. Fear and trauma, facing death and killing caused stress and psychological strain. Honor and shame, social pressure to fight bravely was immense. Cowardice was deeply stigmatized. Comradeship, bonds between soldiers could provide support, but also intensified grief over losses. Without mental resilience, many soldiers broke down. Ancient medical knowledge was limited. Wounds, treated with rudimentary surgery, herbal remedies, and bandaging. Infections, common and often fatal. Recovery, injured soldiers faced long convalescences, often without proper care. A serious wound was often a death sentence. War shaped politics, economics, and daily life. Military service, a key duty of citizens, affecting family and economy. Funding wars, taxes and resources drained by constant conflict. Veterans, Some received land or honors, but many returned disabled or destitute. The costs of war extended far beyond the battlefield. Without rigorous training, physical fitness, and mental toughness, the ancient Greek soldier was doomed. Physical exhaustion, long marches, heavy armor, and intense combat were overwhelming. Fear and chaos, many fled or froze under fire. Lack of support, no modern medicine or trauma care. Social pressure, fear of shame could push you into fatal situations. Surviving a day was a heroic feat, not a given. The ancient Greek warrior lived a harsh, dangerous life demanding strength, discipline, and courage. To last a day on the battlefield or at sea, you needed more than weapons. You needed a warrior's mindset and body. Without preparation and grit, you wouldn't just fail. You wouldn't last a day. Ancient Greek medicine laid the foundations of Western medical thought, yet the reality of health care was far from the modern, sterile hospitals and pharmacies we take for granted today. In a world without antibiotics, X-rays, or even basic sanitation, surviving illness or injury required a strong body, luck, and deep knowledge of the local healing practices. This chapter dives into the state of health, medical beliefs, treatments, and why without adaptation, you simply wouldn't last a day in the face of disease and injury in ancient Greece. Ancient Greek medicine was a complex mix of empirical observation, natural philosophy, and religious ritual. Hippocratic influence, Hippocrates c. 460,370 BC, known as the father of medicine, emphasized observation, diagnosis, and natural causes rather than supernatural explanations. For Humer's theory, health was thought to depend on the balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Imbalance is caused disease. Divine intervention. Despite emerging scientific ideas, many still sought healing from gods like Asclepius and through prayers, sacrifices, and pilgrimages. Without accepting these combined approaches, effective healing was difficult. The ancient Greeks faced many health challenges. Infectious diseases. Poor sanitation meant infections like dysentery, typhoid, and respiratory illness were common. Wounds and trauma, battle injuries, cuts, and broken bones were frequent, often treated crudely. Chronic conditions, arthritis, dental problems, and parasitic infestations were widespread. Malnutrition, especially among the poor, limited diets caused vitamin deficiencies. Modern readers might be shocked by the prevalence and severity of these conditions. Healing was practiced by a range of specialists, physicians iatroi, trained in observation and theory, often following Hippocratic methods. Surgeons performed operations like wound treatment, bone setting, and minor surgeries. Herbalists and midwives used plants and traditional knowledge for remedies and childbirth. Asclepiads, families claiming descent from Asclepius, offering religious and medical services. No formal standardized training existed, so practitioner skill varied widely. Treatments combined natural remedies, surgery, and rituals, herbal medicine, plants like willow, pain relief, and opium poppy, sedative, were common. Bloodletting and purging, used to restore humor balance, though often harmful. Surgery, mostly external, such as draining abscesses or setting fractures. Healing sanctuaries, patients visited temples of Asclepius for dream therapy and ritual healing. Hygiene, bathing was encouraged for health, but clean water was not always available. Some treatments were surprisingly effective, others were dangerous or ineffective. Ancient Greek cities had rudimentary sanitation. Aqueducts and wells provided water but often contaminated. Sewage, waste disposal was primitive. Open drains and latrines were common. Public baths helped hygiene but also spread disease if not maintained. Plagues and epidemics could devastate populations with little effective control. You'd constantly face risks of infection just from daily life. Childbirth was perilous, high infant mortality. Many children died young due to disease and poor nutrition. Maternal mortality, complications in childbirth were common. Midwives' role, provided assistance but had limited medical tools. Exposure, some infants were abandoned due to economic or social reasons. Surviving childhood in ancient Greece was itself a challenge. Ancient Greeks recognized mental illness but understood it differently. Humoral theory, mental disorders linked to humor imbalances. Philosophical approaches, some believed in the power of reason and music to heal. Treatment, mostly herbal remedies, rest, and sometimes ritual. Modern psychiatric care was absent, making severe case is difficult to manage. Without a robust constitution, understanding of remedies, and acceptance of cultural practices, survival was precarious. Infections could quickly turn fatal without antibiotics. Injuries, minor wounds could become deadly. Malnutrition weakened bodies, reduced resistance to disease. Mental stress, illness and injury often worsened by social isolation. Ancient Greek healthcare was as much about social adaptation as medical skill. While ancient Greek medicine contributed enormously to medical knowledge, the everyday reality was harsh and unforgiving. To survive a day in this world, you needed physical resilience, knowledge of healing customs, and a willingness to embrace a system very different from modern medicine. Without these, survival was a matter of chance. After exploring the many facets of life in ancient Greece, from the unforgiving battlefield and the grueling social rituals, to the limited health care, austere diet, and rigid societal expectation, becomes clear, surviving a single day there was no small feat. Ancient Greece was a world where physical toughness, mental resilience, social savvy, and acceptance of harsh realities were essential. The comforts, conveniences, and protections we take for granted today simply didn't exist. Would you last a day? Without adaptation, probably not. You would have to wrestle with the danger of disease and injury with primitive medical care, the demands of social and religious customs that governed every action, the scarcity and monotony of food, the brutal discipline of the military or the social rituals like the symposium, the constant threat of violence, famine, or social exclusion. The ancient Greeks themselves knew life was hard. Their myths, philosophies, and histories often reflect a deep awareness of human fragility and struggle. But they also demonstrated remarkable endurance and creativity, laying the foundations for much of Western civilization. In the end, understanding why you wouldn't last a day is just about highlighting how tough their world was. It's about appreciating the strength and complexity of the people who lived through it. So, if you ever find yourself wishing for the good old days of ancient Greece, remember, surviving those days took more than luck. It took a mindset and lifestyle radically different from our own. Many of us wouldn't last a single sunrise without. Thank you for taking this deep dive into a world where survival was a daily challenge. If you want to revisit any part or explore other ancient civilizations next, just say the word.